Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Guess what? We finally get to talk about a tablet that I don't even think anybody really wanted to talk about, but I'm going to hit on it because I got at least 3 comments wanting for me to address it, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. And we're talking about none other than the iPad mini 3 today. So the iPad mini 3 is actually one of those super interesting devices that really, it was kind of an update from the previous model, but at the same time, it was one of those devices that Apple probably couldn't have released, and it probably wouldn't have made that big of a difference if I'm being honest. And the reason I say that is because the iPad mini 3 from the iPad mini 2 was just a slight update in really almost every single which way except maybe the screen and Touch ID. Other than that, the iPad mini 3 was pretty much the same exact device as the iPad mini 2. Which isn't a horrible thing, but it is one of those things to kind of keep in mind when you buy it. I mean, you want to get a phone that has, the latest and greatest, and this one technically didn't have it at the time. Now, this thing was released in 2014, so it isn't the latest device anymore. It's definitely outdated, but it isn't a completely unusable device. Like I said, it's still usable. It still has some cool things going for it, but it just isn't the latest and greatest like we know today. Now, looking on the front, it has a 7.9-inch IPS panel. It is a 1536 by 2048 panel, and that's actually a really high resolution panel for a device like this. I was about to say phone. For a device like this, that's actually pretty respectable, and it was technically a Retina display, which is really cool. And I really do like how this panel really looks. I mean, it's not a horrible panel. It does still have a little bit of a gap between the glass and the display, but it's not that big of a deal. And for the price you're paying for it, I don't think you're really going to care about it all that much anyway. I think it's a pretty good panel, and on the bottom you can see you have Touch ID, which is cool, and that's one of the biggest updates coming from the iPad mini 2 to the mini 3. On the top you also have a front camera, which is really cool, and there's still a lot of bezel on this thing for sure, but it's not an end all be all. I don't think really too many people care about it. On the bottom you can see we have the lightning port as well as a headphone jack, as well as a back camera on the back, and really that pretty much covers it up in terms of the outside. There's not a lot of craziness going on. There's no IP certification. There's nothing like that. It's pretty basic at its core, and it's not a bad thing either. I mean, every iPad since this iPad, at least the mini series, has a look like this, and like I said, it's not an end all be all. If we look at the iPad mini 5, that looks almost exactly the same thing as this thing, and like I said, I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just kind of those weird things that, maybe Apple could have changed the design now in 2019 when the iPad mini 5 was released, but it is what it is. But I guess we're not going to complain about it too much now. Now that pretty much covers it up there. Now hitting on the software, the iPad mini 3 started off with iOS 8.1, which is not the latest iOS anymore. I mean, it's definitely outdated, which actually isn't that bad of a software, to be honest. I mean, I think iOS 8 was pretty decent, iOS 9 was much better, and iOS 10 was really good too. And then it kind of went downhill with iOS 11. But this thing is upgradable right now to iPadOS 13, is that right? I wasn't even too sure if the iPad mini 3 even got iPadOS. And yep, of course I'm right, the iPadOS update did not come on the iPad mini 3. It stopped at iOS 12 actually, which is the same time the iPhone 5S did. And these spec sheets really need to get their facts right. I mean, there's so many times I go on a web sheet and something like this, and it's completely wrong. So if you guys are listening, you guys need to get your stuff together. But the iPad mini 3 did not get iPadOS. It stopped at iOS 12, which, like I've stated before, iOS 12, even iOS 11 was really good on the iPads in my opinion. I've always found that every time, iOS is pretty rocky on the iPhones, usually on the iPad it's pretty decent. Even now, iOS 13, a lot of people are complaining about it on their iPhones, but on my iPads, it runs pretty good. Even on my iPhones, I run into some problems, but iPadOS 13 has been pretty good. But iOS 12 was more or less probably one of the safer updates Apple actually pushed in a long time. So the fact that this thing stopped at iOS 12 is a really good sign for at least the couple next years that are coming out. There might be some security updates that are coming out for the iPad mini 3 as well. I'm not too sure if it gotten one recently. I know the iPhone 4S, 5, even the 5S and 6 have gotten some updates on iOS 12 since iOS 13's release, but the iPad mini 3 in terms of software, as you guys know, is outdated, but it does have a really cool thing up its sleeve for that software, and that's actually the checkra1n jailbreak. A lot of people don't talk about jailbreaking on their iPads, but this device is compatible with that checkra1n jailbreak, which is really cool. This thing has the same chipset actually as the iPhone 5S, which is kind of weird, but because of that, you have that capability of jailbreaking this device, which is so cool. I love seeing that, and because of that, you can easily go and add all those cool little tweaks and little cool features that you have with the jailbroken device that you don't necessarily have with a stock device. And still, I'll be honest, there's still a lot of cool things that a jailbroken iPad can do that the latest and greatest iPad Pro cannot do, and that's a really important thing to note. It's not an end all be all, and even if you don't want to jailbreak your device, I mean, I guess it doesn't matter, but you just have that capability on this device where you don't necessarily have it on other devices, which is a really important thing to note. Now that really pretty much covers it up in terms of the software. Now hitting on the performance performance, this thing has the same exact chipset as the iPhone 5S, and I want to say that and get that out of the way. So as I say the performance thing, you just kind of have to keep that in mind. This thing has the Apple A7 chip, a dual-core CPU, and there were 3 different models, a 16, 64, and 128GB model, and all those models had 1GB of RAM. And what I can tell you about the performance is, like I said, it's almost the same exact thing as the iPhone 5S. It's not a really good performing device. I mean, I think it's more so like very, very average. I think that's probably the best way to put it. If I had to be honest, I probably wouldn't be able to use this on a daily basis. I mean, if I had to, I would, if I didn't have a choice, obviously I would have to find a way. But this thing, I think in a lot of ways is probably even slower than my iPhone 5S. With my 5S, it has a lower resolution display, so as soon as I click something, it usually doesn't take too long for it to boot up into the screen, even though it takes a while to load. The iPad mini 3, it just doesn't seem like a smooth experience. It seems like a pretty glitchy experience overall, which, like I said, it isn't a crazy thing. It's not like an end-all be-all, but it is something to kind of keep in mind as you're going and progressing and getting an iPad. And this iPad has not aged that well. I mean, this thing has the same chipset as a 2013 iPad, so in terms of performance, it's really not that good if I'm being honest. Had Apple put in the A8 chip, I think it would have been a little bit different. Maybe performance would have been a little bit better here and there, but still at that level, it's not that great. I mean, like I said, I think it gets the job done for some people, but for a majority of people, I don't think they would be happy with this performance at all, and that's just me being honest. I don't think it's a horrible device though. I mean, if you still own it, keep it, but the iPad mini 4 definitely is an improvement there, and this one is just not that good of a performing device. It just hasn't held up that well throughout the years since it's been released. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it. Now, I'm gonna hit on the camera super quickly. This thing has a single 5-megapixel camera on the back and a 1.2-megapixel camera on the front. You can shoot HD videos on that front camera, which is really cool. And on iPads, most people, I would say, use the front camera more than the back camera, because they're most of the time, taking photos of themselves, and they're taking selfies, or they're most of the time on FaceTime, and that's one of the more important things. This thing does have FaceTime, which is cool, so if you get a FaceTime call or something, you have that capability to respond to people back on the iPad mini 3, which is cool. But other than that, I mean, the back camera, it gets the job done. I guess you can take photos on it, but it is a 5-megapixel sensor, and it's even worse than the iPhone 5S's camera, so it's really not that good of a camera. If you need a camera, then I guess it's okay, but other than that, I wouldn't really recommend people buying this phone or buying this iPad for the camera itself. But like I said, it's just an extra accessory that you have on this thing, so that's cool. But like I said, most people are probably going to use that front camera, and I think it's probably not the best choice. I think it's very, very average, and probably even at that, it's a compliment. So that pretty much covers it up in the camera standpoint. Now, ending off with the battery, and again, just like any other iPad, this is probably one of my favorite things about an iPad. This thing has a 6,470 mAh battery, and that's one of the biggest highlights of this tablet for sure. Really, whatever you're going to do with it, it's going to be able to handle it in terms of the battery department. If you're using it, if you try to run this thing dry for a day, it's going to be pretty hard to do it. And to give you some perspective, this thing has about twice the size of a battery as the iPhone 11 Pro, and that's a pretty big size battery to have on an iPad, and this thing is severely underpowered. The screen on this thing is pretty high resolution, but because of that performance factor, it's not like having 4GB of RAM and having the A13 or anything. It's a very, very average performing device, and it's even below average, and because of that, it has a pretty big battery, and that's really, really cool. This thing will be able to last you for a very long time. That's one of the biggest highlights of this device. And to give you another perspective, if the battery even depreciated like 1,000 or 2,000 mAh, that's still like a 4,000 to 5,000 mAh battery, which is still super impressive. And this thing will definitely last you for multiple days, and on standby, it'll last you for a month at least, or maybe even multiple months, who knows. So in terms of the battery life, that really pretty much covers that. The battery life on this thing is very, very good. Now, to kind of sum up the video and to answer the question, first of all, my voice is cracked like 30 times, and if you made it this far, please don't comment about my voice cracking. Just kidding, do it, it's okay. But what I can tell you is, to answer the question, should you pick up an iPad mini 3 in 2020? I will say absolutely not. This thing is not worth it in 2020. There's really not too much value in it. It doesn't have iPad OS. It has iOS 12, which is pretty good, and even though it has a really, really big size battery, that's really the main thing going for it. Other than that, it doesn't really have a lot of cool things for it, dude, to be honest. If you're a student or something, I would at least go for an iPad mini 4. That thing does have iPad OS and is still getting support for a little bit longer. So that device, I would probably recommend people to get over this one. But really, in reality, the iPad mini 3, I would highly recommend not picking up in 2020. I would much rather you pick up an iPad mini 4 or even an iPad 10.5 inch, spend a little bit more money, get that device. That will definitely lead you much better in your life than the other one. So I'll leave links to the cheapest iPad mini 4 and the cheapest iPad 10.5 inch that I find on Amazon, and I'll link it down in the description below. You can get it from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that is pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section as well. Hit that like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it'll mean so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel. All those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate it if you guys could check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.